Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Pete Damiano. I direct the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and I would like to welcome you in our Forkenbrock series on public policy, Politics of Immigration. As you can tell, we choose the easy issues on which to hold these discussions. We did one on agriculture and water quality a couple of weeks ago, which we'll solve that one quickly. Healthcare reform, subprime mortgage crisis, all these kinds of things that we choose. But the reason that obviously we haven't solved these is because these are difficult issues. These are very challenging issues. And so what the Public Policy Center is all about is bringing people together from a variety of different perspectives so we can have a civil dialogue and a civil discourse to actually try to move forward in some way on these. Our primary mission at the center is to do background research on a variety of different areas to help inform policymakers, and then we use these community engagement activities to then share that information with policymakers and the public and students and others. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, we'll have a mix of members of the community, graduate students, undergraduate students, faculty members, and others that will be involved in listening to the discussion today. We're very excited about the panel that's here. This is also the next in what we're calling our series, the run-up to the Iowa caucuses. And in Iowa, we're very fortunate to have all of this attention focused on us because of all of the activity. And at least on the Republican side this time, there's going to be a lot of activity, as everybody knows, leading up to the caucuses, which right now are scheduled for February 1st of 2016. And that provides an opportunity to, by having these events, posting this material on our website, at least trying to interject these important issues into their discussion and their dialogue, at least in some small way. I would like to thank our sponsors and co-sponsors for this. Our lead sponsor, in addition to the Public Policy Center, is the Department of Political Science. International programs, the University of Iowa College of Public Health, the UI Labor Center, UI School of Journalism and Mass Communication, Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Sociology, the Center for Human Rights, School of Urban Regional Planning, and then some community members, the Iowa City Area Chamber of Commerce and the Johnson County Democratic Party, and we do reach out again to both sides to try to get that sponsorship. Again, they're not financial, but a lot of those is just in kind and just helping to get the word out on things. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Ann Ricketts, who is Associate Vice President for Research and Economic Development, to give the official university welcome.
Thank you, Pete, and good morning, everyone. As Pete said, my name is Ann Ricketts, and on behalf of the Office of the Vice President for Research, it's my pleasure to join Pete and Professor Rocha in inviting you to this Forkenbrock Symposium. I was in a really good mood on the way to work this morning, and if I'm being honest, the truth is I'm not always that cheerful about going to work in the morning. So it got me to thinking, what is it that I really value, what we truly value about the Public Policy Center? Why was I looking forward to coming here? And I concluded that it's this. In the Public Policy Center, you have all that you want from a major research university: academic rigor, scientific rigor, serious research, intensive study. But you also have traits that we don't readily associate with the university: timeliness, nimbleness, and direct relevance. Now, don't get me wrong, across the university, there's a lot of basic research going on, some of which we won't know the implications for a generation, and that's critically important too. But it's nonetheless gratifying that at the Public Policy Center, they take all of that academic research and gravitas and apply it to the issues of the day. And the Forkenbrock series has that in spades. Pete already mentioned some of the topics: financial crisis before it was cool, women in politics, climate change. If the Forkenbrock series was a soap opera, we would call it "These Are the Issues of Our Lives." They always take on relevant issues. Which brings us to today's topic, immigration. I can't think of anything more important in our state, in our country, in the world, than immigration right now. And it brings up another trait that really Pete alluded to. The Public Policy Center doesn't shy away from challenging issues and controversy. They take them head on. So I congratulate you on picking such a provocative topic. I know that you may well have difficult dialogues during the day. It's a sensitive issue. But where better to have those difficult and challenging dialogues than in this space where we bring serious scholars and community thought leaders together in a very civil environment. So I welcome you again, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, Ann, for those very kind remarks. One other housekeeping issue for people who want Wi-Fi. On your table, there are little slips with the password on there so you can log into the Wi-Fi. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Renee Rocha, Department of Political Science here at the University of Iowa. And Renee has been the lead content expert on helping to pull this all together. What are the topics we really need to cover? Who are the kinds of people we need to bring in? He's been a great collaborator and really have appreciated his involvement with this. He'll give a few remarks and then introduce our keynote speakers.
Thank you, Pete. Thanks to everybody who came, especially, I know it's a busy time, busy point in the semester, but we hope we'll make this worthwhile to you. Immigration is a topic which is, and as already been alluded to, it's especially important to the state of Iowa, right? It's really transforming the state in very fundamental ways. It's a state which has been very homogenous in a few different ways, economically, perhaps arguments that it's socially or culturally, racial and ethnically as well. And the face of Iowans is beginning to change, right? So the Latinos now comprise about 5% of the state. Estimates are by 2025, 2030, they'll be somewhere between 12.5%, 13%. 2050 is a long way away, but the census projections currently have the Latino population at about a quarter of the population by that point in time, which is going to just be a remarkable divergence from where we are today. It's important that the University of Iowa, as the lead flagship research university of the state, be at the forefront of understanding this issue and how this issue impacts the state, the nation, and the world. And so this is just one event which really highlights the university's commitment to understanding immigration, Latino studies, Latino politics more generally. We have two really distinguished speakers that I would like to introduce as part of our keynotes. We have Maria Cardona, who is a very highly regarded Democratic political consultant working with the Dewey Square Group. She has appeared in multiple media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, Univision, Telemundo. I've actually, believe it or not, I've followed your commentary for over a decade. I actually remember an argument between you and Leslie Sanchez on PBS NewsHour. I showed on the 2004 election. I showed to my classes right when I began. So I'm very excited to finally be able to meet you, to have you speak here. We also have Stephen Viramontes, who is a political consultant working with Republican candidates, helping to help their outreach into the Latino community. He was very successful in business and marketing, and then translated those efforts and energies into the political world a little bit later on in his career. And so we have two perspectives from two different ideological camps, but also from people doing, I think, very different, interesting, and valuable kind of work. So I think we'll hear first from Maria, and then we'll hear from Stephen, and then I hope we'll have plenty of time for a lively Q&A. So Maria, if you want to go ahead and come up, we'll hear from you first.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to the University of Iowa and the Policy Center for inviting me. This is clearly an issue that is near and dear to my heart and has been key to my professional work for over 2 decades, starting from the time that I worked for the Democratic National Committee as the very first director of Hispanic media, right when I graduated from college several years ago. But it has been an issue that has been clearly at the forefront for a very long time in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms, and it has evolved throughout the years. And what has been so interesting to me is how the politics of it have evolved as well. So I'm going to sort of lay out a little bit of the groundwork of where we are now, of where I believe we are now, and then I'm going to take us back to how this has evolved and the kind of work that I have been involved in, from research to activism, and how I have seen that evolution firsthand, and what I think are the challenges now going into the 2016 election, not just for the Republicans, because clearly they have huge challenges on immigration, but I think also for the Democrats and what they need to do to make sure that this is an issue that is front and center, and that the communities that are impacted by this are the ones who are actually leading the fight for change. So you mentioned some of the numbers, and I think what is critical is to note that nationally, right now, about 1 in 5, 1 in 6, depending on the research that you see, 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 Americans are of Hispanic descent. In 2050, that will be 1/3. So 33% of the American, not just population, but electorate will be of Hispanic descent in 2050. And that, to me, I think underscores, not just from a public policy standpoint for immigration, but for every policy, how we really have to look at our approaches to these issues that are now going to be affecting a huge part of our workforce as a country. There are 2 sayings in Spanish. One is, dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres. And that means, tell me who you hang out with, tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are. And there's another saying that says, haz reputación y acuéstate a dormir. Haz fama y acuéstate a dormir. And what that means is, create your reputation, create your fame, and then you can just go to sleep. And those 2, I think, really frame the huge, tremendous challenges that the Republican Party face when it comes to national presidential electoral politics, immigration, and the Hispanic community. And I'll explain those in a little bit, but before I do that, I want to go to the evolution part. When I really started to delve into this was in about 2002, 2003, when I was working for a group called the New Democrat Network, and they had started a new Hispanic Strategy Center, really starting to look at the numbers of the Hispanic electorate, how they were changing, and how they were impacting and evolving the politics of presidential elections in the United States. And what we found is that at that moment, the majority of Hispanics were supporting Democrats, but George W. Bush and his campaign folks, Ken Mehlman, Karl Rove, Matthew Dowd, who are all the folks who surrounded him, really understood how important it was for the Republican Party to speak differently to Latinos. And they did that. And George W. Bush, I think, was a prime candidate to be able to do that because he was from Texas. He understood the Hispanic community. He grew up with the Hispanic community. His brother Jeb is married to a Mexican woman, which will be an issue, I think, in 2016 as well, if he actually makes it. And so you had a Republican candidate and president who really understood the importance of speaking to this community with an open mind, with an open heart, from an emotional standpoint, and with respect. And I remember during the 03-04 election cycle, when we ran a lot of ads focused on the Democratic Party and what the Democratic Party's policies were for Latinos, in the states where we ran those ads defining the Democratic Party for Latinos, the Democratic Party jumped in numbers of support within the Latino community. But what also happened is that the Kerry campaign at the time, as you remember, John Kerry was the candidate for the Democrats. saw our effort and thought that that was enough. Oh, and let NDN do it. They're doing a great job in focusing on the democratic message for Latinos. But what they weren't doing, and what we couldn't do because of our tax status, we were a 527. For those of you who don't know, that 527s can't coordinate with a presidential campaign. In our ads, we could not mention John Kerry by name. So we were just very generic in terms of the Democratic Party, and we also didn't have enough money to run our ads everywhere where they were needed. So what happened was that the Bush campaign was brilliant. Again, understanding that you need to speak to this community in a very respectful tone. George W. Bush also supported immigration reform, as you remember. And so they did a terrific job in focusing on that kind of interaction with the Hispanic community in all of the key battleground states. Matthew Dowd, who was his pollster at the time, had said famously during that campaign that the Republican Party could not get to the White House without at least 40% of the Hispanic vote. And in fact, that's exactly what they got, and he won the White House. So fast forward from there a couple of years, 2005, 2006, there's a draconian bill in Congress that would have criminalized just being in the country without the proper papers. The Hispanic community went nuts, as they should have, and the immigrant community and the activists. As you remember, huge marches in 2006. Everywhere across the country, millions of Latinos coming out to say, we want respect for our community. Today we march, tomorrow we vote. Huge initiatives and programs were started everywhere in every community to make sure that Latinos were registered to vote, that they would come out to vote, and that they would understand the kind of disrespect that was happening on behalf of the Republican Party to the Latino community. And frankly, it worked. It was a big reason why Democrats took back the House in 2006. And then fast forward to 2008, a huge reason as to why Barack Obama was able to get elected in 2008 with 67% of the Hispanic vote, because that was one of the issues that really, I think, started to flip the election and started to solidify the support of the Hispanic community for Democrats. It was very interesting because, as you remember, before the 2008 election, John McCain was a huge proponent of comprehensive immigration reform. His name was on the bill that had been trying to pass, the McCain-Kennedy bill. His name was on it, but what happened? During the primary of the 2008 cycle, in trying to become the nominee, he tacked so much to the right and even disavowed his own legislation that had his name on it and said that he would not support that. And the Hispanic community came out in droves against him. He did not have the ability to then, in the general election, credibly tack to the center on immigration reform. And so as a result, he completely lost the Hispanic vote, at least couldn't get nearly enough of what was needed. He got 31% of the Hispanic vote, couldn't get enough of what was needed in order to reach the White House. Of course, there were a ton of other issues and lots of other reasons why he lost, but this remains one of the key pieces as to why he was not able to forge that path to victory. So then, fast forward a little bit more, 2008, 2009, 2010, comprehensive immigration reform continues to be top of mind. President Obama gets hugely criticized, and I think rightly so, because he made a promise that he shouldn't have made in 2007, famously to Jorge Ramos, one of the most popular figures in the Hispanic community. He's the anchor on Univision. He famously promised Jorge Ramos that he would deliver comprehensive immigration reform in his first year in the White House. Now, as we all know, anybody who works in politics, you never make that kind of promise, right? Remember George H.W. Bush with, "I will not raise taxes, read my lips," right? You should not do that. Now, granted, in 2007, when he made that promise, he had no idea of knowing that the first thing that he was going to have to deal with is a possible next great depression if he didn't deal with the economy as the very first thing that he did in office. But again, that's the reason why you don't make those promises, is because you never know what is going to become top of mind and priorities on your plate when you become commander-in-chief. So he made that promise. Jorge Ramos and a lot of Latinos, as they should have, did not let him forget that during the run-up to the 2012 election. So President Obama, I think, did something that was not just necessary, but very smart politically. As the Republicans were continuing to tack to the right on immigration reform, I think not even understanding the lessons that they should have learned from the 2008 election, they continued to demonize immigrants. They continued to talk about immigrants with complete and total disrespect. Iowa is home to one of the biggest proponents of that, Steve King, who frankly has made my job very easy, so thank you for that. He is the poster child for the conservative right, extreme right wing of the Republican Party and the Tea Party on immigration. And he has one of the loudest voices. It doesn't mean that the majority of Republicans agree with him. And this is where I think one of the huge challenges of the Republican Party lies, which is I think there are very reasonable Republicans out there who do understand that this needs to be something that is solved in a bipartisan fashion. So what happened? I think many of those Republicans came together, understood that they needed to do something on this, and were the ones who came together to form the Gang of Eight. But what happened? Before that, for the 2012 election, what the president did that I think was not just necessary, but very smart politically, and he was pushed. He was pushed by the Dreamers. The Dreamers had a fantastic initiative, and they had tremendous organization across the country. The Dreamers, for those of you who don't know, are the kids of undocumented immigrants who came to the United States through no fault of their own and who were raised here and know no other country. Many of them don't even speak Spanish, but who want to be able to contribute legally, want to live outside of the shadows, want to come to great universities like yours and be able to make something of themselves and live in this country that they call their own. And so what President Obama did was he passed by executive action what we call DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And what that means is that he essentially shielded from deportation all of these Dreamers, as long as they didn't have a criminal record, so that they could live outside of the shadows, they could live legally here, they could go to school, they could get a job if they graduated. And so this was a huge, huge issue and huge news in the Hispanic community. And frankly, it turned around what at that point had been, I think, a lack of enthusiasm for President Obama and the Democrats because of the fact that he had been seen not only as having broken his promise on immigration, but also because of the numbers of deportation that have happened under his administration. Janet Murguía, great friend of mine, famously said, she's the head of the National Council of La Raza, famously said that President Obama had become the deporter-in-chief, and this was right before the 2012 election. And so that famously has, I think, really stuck in the minds of the administration and pushed them to announce this executive action called DACA. So that also then became, I think, a calling card for the Republican extreme right wing to go against the president on DACA. But what happened is that clearly these are probably the most sympathetic kids that are stuck in this limbo, which is one of the effects of the lack of comprehensive immigration reform in the country. And so the majority of Americans were for DACA. The majority of Americans actually are for comprehensive immigration reform, and they have been for a very long time because they understand that this is something that we need to solve. They understand that our broken immigration system is not something that is sustainable. It's hurting our economy. It's hurting businesses. And so what happened, and so for DACA in 2012, I think that was a big driver as to why the president was able to gain 71% of the Hispanic vote in 2012, a huge reason as to why he was reelected. Mitt Romney, as you remember, famously did the same thing as John McCain in terms of tacking to the right during the primary, probably with the thought of wanting to tack to the center, but he went so much to the right that there was no way, no path to get to the center. What did he do during the primary? He famously talked about self-deportation, and that is what his policies would be. The Latino community, again, outraged. How is this possible? What kind of a disrespect is this? He was never able to recover from that. And so that brings me to want to explain a little bit as to how this whole issue of immigration reform plays in the minds of Hispanics around the country when it comes time to make a decision politically. Because it has been so front and center in terms of activism and in terms of key issues in presidential elections, it would be very easy for folks who aren't paying the kind of attention that us hacks like to pay to these kinds of issues to believe that immigration reform is the #1 issue for Hispanic voters across the country. And that is not true. Immigration reform does not even register as 2, 3, 4, or 5, sometimes even 6 or 7. But what it has become is what I call a filter issue. And what that means is that even though Latinos do not go to the polls and make a decision on where a candidate stands on immigration reform because they're a voter, this is not something that affects them directly or personally as a person. They are here legally. They are citizens. They are voting. But what happens is that most Latino voters in this country either know someone who is in limbo without papers, they know someone who has been deported, they know families who have been ripped apart or have heard about these nightmare stories in their communities, and they believe that the candidate that they vote for has got to have a stance on immigration that respects the community, has got to at least speak in respectful tones to the community, and if a candidate does not do that, if they do not go through that filter, past that threshold, they're not going to listen to that candidate on any other issue. And that is why it's a huge danger for Republicans when they tell audiences exactly what I'm telling you, which is, Latinos don't vote on immigration reform. Well, that's true. But they're also not going to vote for your candidate if you don't talk in respectful tones to the community. And those, I think, are the two issues that they have not been able to consolidate. They tried to. After the 2012 election, the Republican Party, the RNC, famously started what was called the autopsy to try to figure out what happened, what went so wrong in the 2012 election for Mitt Romney. And one of the key components of that autopsy was that they needed to speak in a much more respectful tone to Latinos. Not just that, but it actually says in this document that they need to support comprehensive immigration reform as a party if they ever want to have even the hope of getting to the White House in the next several cycles. It says that in their document. And what have they done since then? They have gone completely the opposite way. And so where does that lead us now? Again, I talked about the effort by a couple of very reasonable Republicans, reasonable at the time, in the Senate who came together to form the Gang of Eight that were able to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill in the Senate in a bipartisan way for Republicans, for Democrats, famously passed this law or this act, and it was waiting for action in the House. And so what happens? That was in 2013. We kept waiting. Republicans, in the Senate kept talking about, okay, it's the House's turn to act. What happened is that John Boehner, which has been, I think, one of the key challenges of his speakership, was never able to get his caucus to agree to move forward on immigration reform. Democrats were even saying, look, we don't expect you to take this legislation and approve it as is. They talked about wanting to do it piecemeal. They wanted to focus on border security first. They wanted to focus on enforcement first. Democrats, and even the president, said, fine, let's do that. Do your piecemeal legislation. Let's do pieces of this. And then we can come together and figure out how this can become a comprehensive effort to make sure that we fix everything at the same time. They were never able to get it together. The right-wing, conservative extremists in the House did not let John Boehner ever bring this to any kind of vote on the floor. There were several votes in the House of Representatives on immigration, but they were all to either repeal DACA, they were all to either make enforcement a huge priority issue and criminalize many immigrants that were here. And so again, doing exactly the opposite of what the Republican Party establishment strategists said that the party needed to do in order to be able to have even the hope of getting to the White House in 2016. And then famously, you have folks like Steve King, but Steve King is not the only one. You have several state legislators across the country. There's one in Kansas who talked about how one of the ways to get rid of undocumented immigrants was to shoot them from helicopter like feral hogs. That's terrific. Great for the Republican Party, right? For them to be saying things like that. For Steve King to famously be saying that, the majority of undocumented immigrants are drug mules. But the problem is, and like I said before, I don't believe that this is something that majorities of Republicans believe. But what happens is that the leaders in the Republican Party have never had the wherewithal and the moral core to come out and say, that is not how we should be talking to the Hispanic community. That is not right. The one that has come the closest is Jeb Bush. But we're also seeing Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and several of the contenders now in the Republican primary trying to really walk that tightrope because they know, and you all famously know this, you get more attention than any other state during this time right now as we lead into the 2016 election. You have a lot of the Republicans coming here and coming to the other early states to talk about how they want to repeal the president's executive action, and his executive action was actually something that was done because of the inaction in Congress. And you have them talking about how there's just right now no effort in the party to focus on comprehensive immigration reform. They only talk about securing the border and enforcement first. And for Latinos, those are buzzwords for, we do not want you in this country. And that, I think, is one of the critical barriers that the Republican Party will continue to have going into the 2016 election. So the president passed executive action. Again, as a result of this complete inaction, he gave the House a year and a half to do something on immigration, to do something. They were not able to get their act together. They didn't do anything. John Boehner essentially caved to his extreme right wing, didn't do anything. The president finally said, if you guys aren't going to do anything, I'm going to at least do what I can under my power that the Constitution gives me to be able to put in fixes that will help our economy, that will help keep families together, that will help our national security, until and when you guys get it together to pass comprehensive immigration reform. If you want to stop my executive action, this is what the president says, the easiest way to do this is to pass legislation. Once legislation is passed, my executive action will be nullified. But Republicans, again, have not been able to get it together. And now what we all need to take a look at is the kind of language that they're going to be using during this primary to talk about the president's executive action and where it stands in terms of their support for comprehensive immigration reform. Every single Republican candidate has said that their first act in the White House, if they were to get elected, would be to repeal the president's executive action on immigration. There's a poll that just recently came out where it says that 89% of the Hispanic voters in this country support the president's executive action. Not immigration reform, the president's executive action, 89%. 57% of Americans overall now support the president's executive action. Executive action. Yes, they would prefer for Congress to be dealing with this. They would prefer for this to have come through legislation, but guess what? The president would have as well as Democrats, because that is the real fix. The president's executive action is a Band-Aid. It's not a fix. It's not a long-term solution. We need a long-term solution. And as long as Republicans are not able to talk about a long-term solution for comprehensive immigration reform, and as long as Republicans are not able to diminish the kind of ugly, hateful rhetoric that is in their party, and as long as Republicans are not able to speak to the Latino community in respectful tones about solutions for comprehensive immigration reform that include a path to legalization and eventually citizenship, I don't see a way that any Republican contender today will have a path to getting to La Casa Blanca in 2016. So I will leave it there.
Okay, great. And then we have Stephen Viramontes.
For the next 30 minutes that I'll be speaking to you, 63 Latinos will be born and 121 white Americans will die. My name is Stephen Viramontes. I'm a millennial, I'm a Mexican American, and I'm an unapologetic Republican. For the past several years, I left the business world to follow a passion of trying to bridge gaps and build bridges within the Hispanic community around conservative values. I'm not a politician. I'm an entrepreneur. I don't have a poli-sci degree. I don't represent a party, and I don't represent a candidate. I have a business degree. I represent myself, and I represent my community. I have a passion to help and provide opportunity for all. I don't apologize for my conservative principles. I truly believe that economic freedom pulls individuals out of poverty and improves their lives. I believe that economic freedom empowers individuals to live the American dream. Technical difficulty here. I grew up in Central California. My family would often work in the fields picking grapes to be dried as raisins. My father, from South New Mexico, was one of 14 children. He tried the best he could to provide a better life for me and my family. He was an entrepreneur as well. And like most entrepreneurs, we fail more times than we succeed. As the oldest of 5 children, my father would put us in this little red wagon. And he would pull us door to door and knock on people's doors and ask them if he could paint their house number on their curb, and to pay him whatever they felt his job was worth. Sometimes we'd go to 2 houses, sometimes we'd go to 10 houses, but after every single time we went to a house, he thanked God. And after we had enough money, he'd pull us down to the 7-Eleven, and he'd buy bread, milk, and eggs. And it goes without saying that we ate a lot of French toast growing up in our house. And he did this for many years as he tried to start business and fail and start again. I want to share 3 things with you today about my experiences and from what I believe and how my community and how immigration affects the 2016 elections. My belief is in less talking and more doing. This is Henry. In 2012, after the presidential election, I saw there was a serious problem with the community. And I ran into Henry in Las Vegas. I'm wearing a Fresno State hat and a USC t-shirt. They actually played each other in the bowl game that year. Growing up in Fresno, our sports teams weren't very good. So we had to look for a stronger Pac-10 at the time, or Pac-12 powerhouse to kind of supplement our sports affiliations. And Henry, he's from Sinaloa, Mexico. He was out there with his wife selling the best Sonoran hot dogs you'd ever taste, wrapped with bacon, with grilled jalapenos and onions. And Henry recently had come from Mexico, but his wife was a citizen. And I asked him about how he felt about the previous election. And his answer is that he felt that those candidates didn't represent him. And who can blame him? And I asked him, well, what would you want? And he specifically said, I just want to be left alone, and all I want to do is work here. And immigration reform needs to encompass those factions. They need to be able to provide opportunities for individuals to come out of the shadows, to live the American dream. Now, living the American dream, there's a linked fate that is taught by Luis Fraga from Stanford University. And the American dream is actually defined better by Jennifer Horschild from Harvard, where American dream just means a higher income, personal freedom, equal rights, and to enjoy the safety and security for their families. But that American dream is not available to many Latinos because of the current limbo status of our immigration policies. Many politicians, many from my own party, demonize members of my community. It's degrading. And as you see this slide, it's funny, but the reality is it's very true. This is how many of our elected leaders, specifically from my party, view the Hispanic community. And one thing that the GOP, if anyone is here as a Republican, needs to do is stop deceiving themselves and telling themselves that Latinos are inherently conservative. They are not. The data couldn't be more clear, as stated earlier. The most a Republican presidential candidate has ever received is 44%. And that's the best they can do, is not even half. So the more honest that we are with ourselves about the Hispanic community, I think that's step one. Now, in 2011, or let's take a step back, in 2010 is when I first got involved in politics. You guys, I'm from Arizona. You probably remember a bill called SB 1070. It was the anti-immigrant bill that swept across the entire country. That was the Show Me Your Papers bill. The individual that sponsored that bill was my neighbor, Senate President Russell Pierce. I am a Mormon. He is a Mormon. We go to the same congregation. My children trick or treat at his home every Halloween. When he passed this bill, something did not settle with me. He represented the party in which I claimed to be a member of. But how could someone of my faith, first and foremost, and a member of my party, act this way towards members of my community and my family? So I got involved. And as a Republican It was very difficult. I was the lone voice amongst very few at the time that would stand up to members of the party. In 2011, as you may have not followed, we recalled Russell Pierce. I spearheaded that campaign. And the reason why is because Mesa is where I live. MIT and UCLA recently did a study about conservative cities, and the city of Mesa is the most conservative large city in America, with registration of Republicans over 67% in a city of 600,000. Very significant population. However, that same community is also represented at 30% in the Latino community and another 10% of the Mormon community. And if you look at the Pew Research poll that was done several months ago, Mormons have the highest affinity for Republicans than any other religious denomination. So how could a strong Mormon community and a strong Latino community get rid of the most conservative of all conservatives? It's because the majority of Republicans believe as I do. It's just that their voice is drowned out by those that are far more extreme. And that needs to stop. Pew and the NLS analysis indicates that Latinos live, work, and socialize with other Latinos, and that 2/3 of them know someone that is undocumented. This linked fate that I'm referring to, and there's an attachment felt by the U.S. Latinos for immigrants, and we feel that their success, meaning the success of immigrants, is our success. Because for us, we're still the minority trying to live the American dream, therefore still trying to assimilate into this country. And that's why we have a linked fate, because we have the same shared American dream. Kids on the border crisis that we all remember. This is a picture of me standing with a group of Tea Party members, card-carrying NRA members with guns on their hips, trying to stop buses of children coming from Central America at no fault of their own to improve their lives. And this is in the middle of the desert, on that road to one of the shelters these kids were going to. I went out with a group of people to talk to these individuals. You know, we had recently seen this in California in Murrieta a couple of weeks earlier, and now it was happening again in Arizona. So I went, and I talked with these individuals. And it took a lot of courage to stand up to people that I agree with probably, 80, 90% on issues, to tell them that they were wrong and to let the buses pass. After 4 hours of conversation, deliberation, we were able to diffuse the situation, and they were able to prevent the roadblocks from happening. These cars, I'm on the wrong slide, forgive me. These cars here lined up, previous to this picture, were all parked blocking the roads as roadblocks, preventing this bus of children, little kids. Forgive me, I'm a father of 3 children. How can you do that? And it hurts. There's this Latino threat narrative that Leo Chavez from UC Irvine talks about that discusses 3 things: the social and cultural assimilation issues. The second one is the fertility and sexuality of Latinas. And the third is immigration and the depletion on social services. And this Latino threat narrative is emphasized in this image of what they're trying to prevent. But here, we were able to find common ground, that the economy and immigration are hand in hand for Hispanics. For most Latinos, immigration is their personal economy. If they can't work, they can't improve their personal economic conditions. And so there is a linked fate that is connected here. And I believe, again, in less talking and more doing, how this economic impact and this connection with the Hispanic community goes hand in hand is there's a taco shop that was in the backyard of some people's homes, and the city government shut them down, and they had a great product. The reason why they did it out of their backyard is because they were undocumented. So one of the members of the Gang of Eight that was referred to earlier was actually the first congressman that I helped get elected. Now he's Senator Jeff Flake. I called up Senator Flake on the phone, and I said, hey, here's the situation. There's a family that has an undocumented status that their paperwork is in limbo. They're trying to open a business and improve the lives of their family. What can we do? Now, he was able to help expedite that process. But so many Hispanics in our community don't have that privilege of having someone to make a phone call to a U.S. senator to have their documents and their paperwork expedited. As candidates in 2016 looking to the elections, they must reframe their conversation and reframe the priorities and how they communicate to the Hispanic community. A poll that was done in 2012 by Univision and Latino Voices on the on the economy and immigration reads just this way. And here's the question. Let's say one of the candidates had a plan to improve the economy and that you supported that plan. And on immigration, the candidate said the following, quote, illegal immigrants are a threat to America who have committed a crime. We can never support amnesty for illegals. The response, as you would guess, to the anti-immigrant remarks, 59% were less likely to support that candidate. However, if that candidate said, quote, America is a nation of immigrants. We need to treat immigrants with respect and dignity and help them assimilate into America instead of attacking them. 76% of those individuals that heard that comment from the economic plan of that presidential candidate supported those candidates. So we need to be more inclusive. Keep skipping forward on me, excuse me. This Cinco de Mayo last year in the streets of Phoenix. It's me on a stage of 25,000 Hispanics having a concert. We need to stop referring, as Republicans, stop referring to Hispanics as outreach. It's demonizing. We're not some sort of Latino card trick. We're not someone that can be won over. Through these objectifications, we Latinos become an abstract representation of being real Americans by referring to us as outreach. We need to be doing less talking and more doing. The last one is the cultural connection. For GOP candidates, there is a better way. We have to own our mistakes of the past. We have to have conversations and stop counting contacts. I have found as we build relationships of trust and build relationships on shared values that we can transcend the rhetoric and the hostility that we have towards the immigrant community and understand that the linked fate between the Hispanic, the U.S. Hispanic community, and the immigrant community is so interwoven that the fabric cannot be broken. And the only way in which we're able to tap into that is understanding that the relationships with the Hispanic community come before any policy, come before any agenda, but the relationship of trust and mutual respect are the primary in these efforts. So I now have one last thought, which will make all the difference. Don't serve us, serve alongside us. All I can say is I care. I'm a father who loves his country and loves his Latino heritage. And I truly believe that there is a linked fate, and immigrants build this country. And those that are here will come, and those that are yet to come are just as American as you and I are. Thank you.
All right, well, now we'll open it up to Q&A. If there's anybody who would like to stand up and ask a question, or if you will have some, we have some that are written down. You have some cards on your table, I believe. We'll start with, thank you. And feel free to just go ahead and bring them on up. We'll start with the first one. The first question we have here asks, will the move towards normalizing relations with Cuba have any impact on the Hispanic or Latino issues outside of South Florida? So I think this one, which you can both probably address. Why don't we start with you, Maria, and then Stephen?
Sure. First, I want to commend Stephen because there's really nothing in his talk that I disagree with, and I hope Republicans would be smart to listen to you.
I'd be also your worst enemy if they did listen to me.
So on Cuba, that is a really interesting question because the other evolution, and I keep talking about evolution, that we have seen in terms of issues in the Hispanic electorate is the issue of Cuba. 10 years ago, you couldn't think about a presidential candidate talking about normalizing relations with Cuba and then hoping to win Florida. That has changed. President Obama won Florida. Won the Hispanic vote in Florida, both in 2008 and in 2012. Why is that? Because the very conservative Cuban vote in Florida is diminishing. The very conservative Cuban vote in Florida that focused mainly on the politics of Castro is diminishing. They're all older. This sounds crass, but they're dying. And the folks who are coming up, the younger Cubans, are agreeing with Democrats and the president and some Republicans, frankly, like Rand Paul, who essentially believe that our 50-year-old embargo with Cuba has been a complete failure, and what we need to do is something different. And actually opening up economic ties with the Cuban people is something that younger Cubans, because many of them actually do have people back in the country that they would love to be able to keep more in touch with, to go visit, to have them come visit us, whatever it is, to have much more of a real relationship with the people in Cuba is something that the majority of younger Cubans really want. And so I think for Florida, the politics of Florida, this is going to be another one of those issues that is going to be very tricky for Republicans, especially, I think, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, because at least Marco Rubio has come out adamantly against any normalization of relations with Cuba, and understandably so, because that was the environment in which he grew up. But what I think what he's missing is the kind of evolution that I'm talking about and the kind of progress that we actually need to make with Cuba if we actually want what the embargo was specifically aimed at doing in the first place, which was actually helping the Cuban people with economic empowerment and trying for them to be able to live a better life in Cuba. So I think normalizing relationships with Cuba is something that is forward-looking, is something that looks like progress, and is something that, frankly, more and more Cuban voters are agreeing with every day.
No. The reason why is that I believe Cubans represent 3 to 5% of the overall Hispanic demographic, 2/3 of them being Mexican Americans. And so when I look at the demographic changes or on an aggregate level, what's going on in Cuba is very, it's on a micro level of the overall problem I believe that the GOP has, and that's actually an age demographic challenge. And if the only difference that it will make is in the GOP primary on how those older Cubans will turn out and support and respond to the type of policies that are going to be put forth by Republican candidates.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of questions here, and I'm trying to sort through some of the most interesting ones. One of them, I'll start with this one, I think. How can we convince small rural communities, this is particularly salient in Iowa, where obviously a large proportion of our state is rural, that are primarily white, to support immigration reform? Is it important to their community or to their state? How do we make the issue salient to those kind of outside traditional gateways, basically outside of Texas and the Southwest, right?
You want to go first?
Sure. I think I researched quite a bit about the history of the immigrant community here in Iowa, and specifically what goes on here. And I believe that there's a very large and important immigrant community and Hispanic community within your community. And the reason why is because of the manufacturing type of jobs that are here. Now, as the demographic changes happen, they're happening rapidly all across the country, more so in the Southwest, just because of the proximity to the border. But as economic growth happens in through all sectors of the economy, you're seeing the need for low-skilled labor and high-skilled labor to be spread out through the entire country. Now, it's factual to say that immigrants from Mexico or Central and South America are prominently low-skilled labor. And as they move here into these rural communities where there's more manufacturing type of jobs, these are the type of jobs that attract the Hispanic community. And my suggestion is to embrace them, encourage them. They're just trying to live the American dream and provide an opportunity for their families. They don't want their children doing janitorial jobs or working in factories, but they're doing what they can now to be able to provide their families with better opportunities in the future.
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah.
That's why we need comprehensive immigration reform.
I live it every single day in Arizona, my friend.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
I come from the land of Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
So I think if I could comment on just generally, because this is something actually that I lived. And so when I was brought to this country, I was 2. I came from Colombia. We settled in a small town called Leesburg in Florida, Central Florida. Very, very few Latinos there at the time. And when I was growing up, I remember very clearly my father telling us that the burden was on us to open ourselves up to our neighbors and welcome them into our home. And I think that is something that, frankly, our community, the Latino community, needs to do more of. And yes, it's difficult because they already feel like they're demonized. But at the same time, the people who demonize our community are people who don't understand us as a people, who don't probably know very many Latinos, and those that they do know, they think they know, are just simply from the images that they see on television. And so my father always taught us that it's incumbent upon us to bring people that are different from us into our home, into our family, share our culture, share our food, share our music, and let them understand that we really are no different than them, that our hopes and aspirations to live the American dream are no different than them, that is essentially what made America great. And so I think the more that we are able to have these conversations, and the onus is not just on other people welcoming immigrants, but I think it has to be immigrant families also be willing to take a risk and let themselves known in the communities where they are now working, to make people understand that when you have conversations with folks, at the very core, we all want our children to live a better life. I have an 8-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son, and it is no different from any other family that is wanting a better life, a better future, a brighter future for their children. Whether or not you have papers, that doesn't change anything. And so to start those conversations, I think that that will go a long way towards the kind of understanding that you'll need to try to, lower the temperature, if you will.
And to add last one comment to your question, Machiavelli put it, no one wants change because they're too invested in the status quo. Yeah. And for these folks, they're seeing changes within their community, and it's become visual. And for most, that doesn't set very well.
This next question is for Stephen, and I'm particularly interested to know the answer to this myself. The question is, what is the argument that it took, or what specifically did you have to say to those protesters on that road in order to get them to end their blockade and allow that bus through? It's a broader question.
It was a very long, I don't know if it was one specific thing that was said, but at the end of the day, what I told them is that these children came here at no fault of their own. If you want to change immigration, if you don't want to change immigration reform, and you don't want these kids to come here, this is the reason why we need immigration reform. Because what I try to explain to these folks is that these kids that came across from the border is not a new phenomenon. These kids have been coming for years. Yep. This is actually under a Bush policy from 2008 called the William Wilberforce Act, where it allowed these immigrants to be able to come here from Central America. And so I was like, these policies that are allowing these children to come here are because of a broken immigration system. If you don't like them, then you are an advocate with me for having reforms. But under the current laws, and you respect the rule of law, these children are entitled to come to this country to be able to seek asylum and to be able to be reunited with their families. And I think it was a combination of that and the fact that we're played into a little bit of their emotional ties of that these are being children and they are innocent, that it got them to be able to steer clear and allow the bus to pass on through.
Great. And this next question, this is the big question going into 2016. The audience member wants to know how each of the possible Republican candidates you guys suspect will fare with the Latino vote, how you think Hillary Clinton will fare with Latino voters. And I'd actually like to flip it. I'd like Maria to comment on how she thinks the Republican candidates would do, and Stephen to comment on how she thinks Hillary Clinton would do.
Nice. Well played.
Well, the way that it's going, like I said at the very end of my remarks, I think we'll be welcoming a Madam President in 2017 to the White House. Hillary Clinton has a phenomenal record and a tremendously close relationship with Latinos across the country. In fact, I worked for her in 2008 against President Obama, and during the primary, she garnered 84% of the Hispanic vote against President Obama. She has a long history with Latinos, starting in the 70s in South Texas, going door to door to register Latinos to vote in the Valley. And so I think Latinos and Latinas across the country could not be more excited about her candidacy. She has already said she is a huge supporter of comprehensive immigration reform. She has said she supports executive action, which we know is hugely popular with the Latino community. But she also understands that that can't be the ultimate solution, that we actually need legislation to make this right. I also think she will have a unique ability, more so than President Obama will, if she becomes president, to actually work with Republicans to make legislation a reality. And so I think all of that are issues that she will be able to talk about during the campaign and understand and help Latino communities understand that she is the one who actually represents their interests.
So of the
I'm sorry, I was supposed to talk about the Republicans.
Yeah, of the Republicans, which one do you think?
Democrats
sorry.
don't listen.
You know, I talk about Hillary Clinton and I get off topic. Well, then I guess the flip side, which is I think that, again, and I mentioned a little bit of this in my remarks, Marco Rubio was in the right place for comprehensive immigration reform. Clearly, he was part of the Gang of Eight, and I gave him huge kudos for that. Unfortunately, he has since done a 180 and has said, similar to what McCain did in 07 and 08, that he does not support that kind of comprehensive legislation now. He thinks it should be piecemeal. But the problem, again, when Republicans say that is they don't say what that means. They only talk about border enforcement. They only talk about border security. And to the Latino community, those are code words. And so, and not in a good way. And so, and then you have Jeb Bush. I think Jeb Bush right now is probably the closest to where a Republican candidate needs to be on comprehensive immigration reform. He has supported in the past. He's done some flip-flops since then, but I think he has tried to make it right. I think his challenge is going to be actually making it through the primary with his stances on immigration reform. And right now, it looks like a lot of conservatives and frankly, the people who come out and vote in the caucuses and in the primaries for Republicans are those who don't want comprehensive immigration reform. So I think it's going to be a very tough tightrope for any Republican candidate to get out of the primary unscathed enough to be able to tack credibly to the center during the general election to be able to be competitive with somebody like Hillary.
And to tie into that, a Republican needs to be willing to lose the primary to win the general election. For Hillary, I don't know. Democrats assume that they have the Latino vote tied up, and the numbers would indicate that they do. However, there is still a large percentage that are still undecided. And like this statistic that I cited earlier about Hispanics that are more willing to support a candidate that is softer on its tone with immigration and has economic agenda they support, the numbers are overwhelming. And so these presidential elections go the ways of the economy. And depending on the candidate's position on the economy and how they tie it into immigration will determine how the Hispanic electorate turn out for the specific candidate. And depending on how Hillary Clinton frames it, she can do one of two things. She can ignore the Hispanic community and assume that they already have the numbers because the Republicans placated too far to the right, which won't happen. Or she can continue to message like she's done and continue to do outreach as Republicans stand by and do nothing. And you're going to see the same election turnouts that we've seen in the past. And I have to caution, as I've seen Republican candidates going around caucusing, going around the caucus state here and around the country, they cannot figure out where they're at on the issue, and they need to get their shit together. And the reason why is because we've learned from the last two cycles. In the last three cycles, you cannot win a national election without 40% of the Hispanic vote, and you can't placate to the far right like Romney and McCain and expect to be able to get and break that number in a general election.
So this next question asks a question about, it contains a quote from the GOP party platform. So the party platform states that we believe that the GOP must fashion its own version of the DREAM Act to avoid a blatant amnesty program. And so the question is, what might this look like? And I think there's a broader question here about what type of comprehensive immigration reform bill could be proposed by the Republican Party which would be palatable to basically to Congress. I mean, the piecemeal approach is the alternative that the House offered to the Senate bill, right? The piecemeal approach, by definition, is not comprehensive, right?
And they haven't done it.
Yeah. And so, what is the alternative plan? I guess is what the questioner would like to know.
Right. Well, the current setup of the House and the gerrymandering effects that took effect in 2010 will not allow for a single omnibus type of bill to be able to pass to the House of Representatives. It's not going to happen. The reason why is because the way that the House is divided up in their each congressional districts and how they are gerrymandered, they were made more safe for more Republicans. And so many Hispanics and minorities were pulled out of those districts, and they no longer represent them. So they're not willing to put their political capital on the line to vote for a common sense reform that needs to take place. Because their greatest threat into a lot of these districts is being flanked from the far right, as opposed to it is having a viable contender from the opposing side. And so if they want to get together and do an immigration reform bill, they've talked about it being piecemealed, and the way that it's been explained to me is that the House is set up into 3 different camps. You have your Steve King camp, which is opposed to any type of reform, which is about 25 members. You have about 90 members that are in the middle that can go either way on certain issues, and then you have your Paul Ryan folks that were ready to sign Senate Bill 744 in 2013, but then the whole Syria situation came into effect. And then you had individual House members that would invoke what's called the Hassert Rule, which prevents any type of bill to being heard on the floor without the consent of the majority party and a majority of that majority. And so you had at a roadblock to be able to even have 744 pass the House. And they talk about piecemealing together. I still believe and a supporter of a comprehensive approach. That is one bill that includes provisions that allow for more guest worker visas, more visas in general for H-1Bs for our high-tech skilled. That's something we haven't even talked about here today. But border security is important, but the best way to secure the border is by having a better legal system. Mm-hmm. If people could come here legally, they wouldn't have to come here illegally. And if we had a system that provided opportunities for more immigrants to come here legally, we wouldn't have an illegal immigration problem.
If Republicans were smart, they would do one of 2 things. They would have already brought up the comprehensive immigration package that was passed in the Senate, in the House. If John Boehner had done that, this would have passed with some of those middle Republicans that you talked about who understand that we need a solution, and the majority, the vast majority, if not every single Democrat. And that would have taken immigration reform off the table for 2016 for Republican candidates. And they would have thanked the party for that. That didn't happen. The other smart thing for Republicans to do, and they can still do, well, actually they can still pass the legislation if they wanted to, and it would still take it off the table to a certain extent. But they could also offer a version of comprehensive immigration reform without, and actually Marco Rubio has started to talk about this, without a path to citizenship, but with legalization. And the reason why I think that would be really smart is because there are a lot of Democrats who are against it because they believe, and I believe this as well, that ultimately you have to have a path to citizenship or you're going to have this whole group of second-class citizens, if you will, with no path other than being in limbo. But in poll after poll of Latinos, they would support a piece of legislation like that because right now the only thing they're interested in is being able to work here legally, which is why they support in such high numbers the president's executive action. And so those are 2 things I think if Republicans were smart they would just do now, because it would take the politics, the poisonous politics of comprehensive immigration reform off the table for presidential candidates. I'm going to tell you guys a secret that I have heard from many Republican strategists in Washington, which is that they believe that, unfortunately, many Republicans, especially a lot of those in the House that Stephen talked about, who are in very safe districts, and even those who are maybe not in such safe districts who don't want to be primaried on the right, they don't give a shit about the presidential elections. They are a party that are happy to become a congressional party so that they can deal with the kinds of issues that they deal with locally. They could care less whether Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Scott Walker have the kind of platform on immigration reform or, frankly, any other issue that is needed to walk the center in a general election in order to be able to garner at least 40% of the Hispanic vote and in order to win. And so you have a lot of strategists who understand that the party needs to change in order to get to the White House, who are frankly saying, we don't know that that's going to be possible because of this other reality that we have. So.
Okay, so the next question is about belief that the Latino community, and you hear this a lot, is very socially conservative, especially on issues relating to abortion. And so we've been talking a lot about the Latino vote within the context of immigration, with immigration as kind of the driver of voting decisions. And so the question is whether or not that belief is true about the social conservatism within the Latino community, and if it is, ways in which the Republicans can leverage it in order to increase their share of the Latino vote, given the issue of immigration and the difficulties they face on that particular front. So why don't we, I think this is good for both of you, Stephen and Maria.
If I were to advise Republicans in this new generation, especially with millennials, my generation, stay away from social issues. Get back to the basics of economics. And if you look at Pew, I believe did a study recently about the social issues of Hispanics. These assumptions that they're socially conservative are just false. Like there's not substantial. And I look at my own family. Like my father is one of 14 brothers and sisters, and they're all entrepreneurs. They're all Catholic. They're all Democrats. There is no correlation. And
what happened to you?
I became Mormon. And so there's no correlation here. And I think that it's a real quick, cheap way of trying to convince ourselves as Republicans that, we can get these people. They're low-hanging fruit. And they're not. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. The only way we can win them over is on economics. So if I were to suggest to Republican candidates is to shelf the social issues, which is frankly impossible in a Republican primary, considering the current demographic makeup of its voters. But you have to shelf the issue and focus on to what has made the GOP successful in the past, and that is economics.
I completely agree, and Stephen is right on that piece of it in terms of the social issues in Latinos, but let me explain why that has become a myth. And that is because way back when Ronald Reagan famously said that all Hispanics are Republicans, they just don't know it yet. And the reason he said that is because at that time, that was many decades ago, Latinos were more socially conservative. But even back then, the reason why Republicans have never been able to get the majority of the Hispanic vote is that economics always trumped these social issues, number one. Number two, and I remember seeing these polls, that these social issues, while maybe back then, right, abortion was something that the majority of Hispanics were against, while maybe back then gay rights was something that, majorities of Latinos were against, it was never an issue that they went to the polls and voted on. It was very personal. They didn't want the government talking about that to them. That was something that they dealt with within their family. They wanted to hear from candidates on the economic piece, period. Fast forward to now, even that has changed. in that socially now, Latinos very much mirror where the country is. And in fact, you see in polls after polls after polls now, and I work with this great group called the Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, majorities of Latinas and Latinos now support a woman's right to choose, and majorities of Latinos and Latinas now support LGBT rights. And a lot of it is because of the generational difference with Latinos. One of the things that we also need to understand is that from a demographic standpoint, Latinos are at least 10 years younger than the mainstream population. So while 36 is the median age of the American voter, for Hispanics that goes down to 26. And so I think even within Republicans, that those social issues become much less important the younger you are. And I think that is the issue overall. So the Republicans who think that are, first of all, wrong, and secondly, I think are doing them and their party a huge disservice, as we have seen in many elections in the past, where the social issues just get Republicans in trouble, period, not just with Latinos, but that will continue to be a huge barrier for them in trying to get more Latino votes.
So another questioner thinks they have the answer to this problem, and that's Rand Paul. Right? And the idea, the questioner's point here is that Rand Paul has the message which you seem to be describing as the one that's needed, right? One of economic freedoms, or an economically business-friendly conservative messages combined with de-emphasis of social issues, and also, importantly, for outreach to the Latino community and to other minority groups, an emphasis on improving or making easier legal immigration to the United States, with less emphasis on punitive criminal justice policies, war on drugs, and also ensuring Rand Paul has emphasized the importance of legislation like the Voting Rights Act. And so when I asked the question a few moments ago about what candidate is the biggest threat to Hillary Clinton in terms of eating into the Democratic share of the Latino vote, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, and I agree those are the two. Those are the two candidates I would have named. But the audience member here has this idea that Rand Paul actually represents the greatest threat. So I don't know. So the question is, whether or not that's a perspective that.
Let me dissuade that audience member of that fact or of that thought for the following reason. If Rand Paul makes it through the primary, which is a big if, because there are huge problems with Rand Paul and the various positions he has taken on issues in the last several years, if he becomes a nominee, the Hillary Clinton campaign and all of the outside groups that support her would have to do just one thing, is run commercials of Rand Paul being with, supporting, and campaigning with Steve King. And that's all they would have to do. Run those commercials over and over and over again.
I like Rand Paul. I believe that he's tapping into the growing generation of millennials, which there's 120 million of us, which is quickly replacing baby boomers as the largest voting bloc, if we ever got out to vote as a voting bloc. But I believe that Rand Paul in general is positioning himself well by not taking such hard stances on social issues and talking about some very difficult problems. I know ending the drug war within the Hispanic community in Arizona is a big topic because illegal immigration and immigration in general in the Southwest all revolves around human trafficking and around drug smuggling. And ending that war would be able to alleviate some of the problems that we have in the Southwest. But I do caution Republicans, specifically Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, and even Scott Walker, that they need to take a strong, firm position on the immigration reform as a general and not waver from it. They cannot follow the same steps that Mitt Romney and John McCain took the last two cycles if they even want to have a prayer at winning the Hispanic community.
And that takes us to 10:30. So let's give another, I think, round of applause for Marie and Stephen. That was really...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was great to be with you.